You may be here for long. So I was asked to talk about addressing sexually inappropriate behavior, really looking at interventions for youth and young adults, really looking at ASD, ID, and other developmental type disorders. And so just kind of to start off with, talking about what were the problematic behaviors we are looking at are those that are clinically concerning, people breaking the rules, violating people's physical boundaries. These are found in both individuals with and without disabilities. So when you're looking at those on the autism spectrum or ID, we're really needing to think about this in the context of their learning styles and their challenges and what kind of successful instruction they have had. So what we see, these are the kinds of inappropriate behaviors. I'm sure this is not news to those of you on the call that are often reported. And again, we want to think about them in the context of what their root causes are. And there are so many that could be there, anywhere from the trauma, if there is trauma in their past history, to what kind of education or instruction have they had about the social norms of sexuality. A lot of these kids, we have to look at where they've come from in terms of how much privacy they have really experienced in the past, and just the stress and anxiety that they have had that could be from other causes as well. All of this can sort of lead into what we're seeing happening. So there are several that I just wanted to pull out and sort of lay the groundwork, because this makes a big difference when you start picking up or selecting the kind of interventions that you would like, is that there is oftentimes an uneven physical and emotional development in these youth, that their physical development may be on target, but their emotional development, social emotional, not so much. And that uneven development can really cause some difficulties in understanding and thinking about what should I do and how do I understand this. That leads into also delays in social awareness, social emotional awareness, and competency, which I'm going to talk a little bit about here in just a second. Of course, their learning and communication challenges, and then oftentimes repetitive, perseverative behaviors can come into play. So just as a quick reminder, in case you're not in that world right now, many of you are, that this is really the timeline for puberty arriving, which oftentimes can happen earlier than we even think about providing instruction. And so this may be something that with families and with educators and caregivers, they're not even thinking about how I need to start providing some awareness and instruction for these individuals that have disabilities. It's not in their scope at that point, and can start to lead into the problems that exist. As well as in typical cognitive development, when you are moving into adolescence, this is a time when you start not thinking like a child and thinking more like an adult. I think we would question that in typical development still, but this is that change that's happening, going into more advanced reasoning and abstract thinking and more formal operational thinking that allows us to think about what's happening, not necessarily right in front of us, but what does this mean in the scope of the future? What does this mean in the scope of things that are not concrete? And all of this is important when you start thinking about interventions. And that kind of leads us, and I'll go through this really quickly, is this whole idea of theory of mind that starts to develop between 4 and 5, which basically is that I can put myself in your shoes in the situation and predict how you might think or feel about what's going on or about what I'm saying. And there are delays oftentimes in theory of mind, especially for those on the autism spectrum. This is a big area that we look at in terms of trying to provide intervention. That delay can really cause difficulty in the person understanding that what I'm doing and in this setting may be interpreted as inappropriate, rude, offensive, or sexual in nature and by somebody else, but that is not my intention. So keeping that in mind can also have delays in this development. And when we have that exposure to any kind of sexual behavior or any kind of media or movies, whether it's personally or what we're viewing on the internet, great difficulty in understanding what this means and is this something that's appropriate for me or in what environments. So moving forward to think about then, what do we need to do? So the first thing that we talk about is that teaching what to do is really important. You can't make any assumption, no matter what it appears on the surface, that the person really is understanding and is intentional with some of these acts. They're not picking necessarily up on facial expressions, cues, body language of others. We really have to think about explicit instruction of what we want this person to do or not to do. And when we're talking about what not to do, we have to really think about what we're suggesting. So if we're thinking about maybe somebody is masturbating in public or having those kinds of behaviors, suggesting alternative places is appropriate, but make sure that it's the right alternative placement. Any bathroom is not okay. If it's your own personal bathroom that you don't share with anybody, that's one thing. But a bathroom in the school or in McDonald's is not going to cut it. So thinking about that as we go forward and teaching what to do. What I think is one of the most foundational things that we need to think about is teaching public or private. A lot of the instruction that happens, people assume that you would understand what is public and what is private. But a lot of these kids and a lot of youth have really not had a good handle on that. So you can see, this is just a little simple visual up here, a way to even start that discussion about what kinds of places and things are public and what are private. And again, many people, what I might think I would never do in public, somebody else might be okay with burping in public or just any other behavior. So you have to think about what the person's experienced and where they would how they would view it. This is sort of maybe something we wouldn't think about in really significant situations, but I think as you go forward and think about the opportunity to model for these kids what is private and what and how we should be able to understand that. A lot of these kids don't have any private time. They either need assistance in dressing and bathing or toileting, or they're not allowed to be alone. So any way that you can sort of model that, closing the door, even partially lowering blinds, prompting the child to wash their own private areas, and labeling body parts as you're doing it. All of these are just kind of natural things. But if you do need resources for instruction, and I know I'm going to show a few, this is not endorsing these necessarily, but saying that there are resources out there and check them out. This resource is a free download, and I think they can have the PowerPoint, can't they? We can get that to it? Okay, so you can have that. So check it out. There's some pretty explicit kind of line drawings here. It starts out just very young and very typical, but then if you are really needing to teach more explicitly, it gives you some information. Social narratives is another one. Some people call them social stories. Can have different kinds of formats, but they basically is giving information. It's not necessarily a do and don't list. It's giving information. So here's an example from a very small study, but I kind of liked it. It's an 11-year-old female having some inappropriate touching behavior in public. You can read what it says. The only thing about this is that we have to be sure here our hands do not touch our private areas in public. We know what public and private is. There was also a 13-year-old that had this social narrative, same kind of thing, telling them what to do. Now, this looks really pretty simple to me, but it's interesting to see the data that came from this. Olivia clearly, at least from this data, shows us that she really didn't understand. I mean, it went from being quite often to basically not at all. So that tells you that while this seems like a really simple intervention, it could have great impact. Here is another social narrative written by two young men that have, I think they have autism or Asperger's syndrome, and it's talking about kissing, which, you know, I don't know how you guys learn difference between kissing your parent and your girlfriend, but clearly there's a difference. If we don't teach it for some of these individuals because of their experiences, they're not going to get it. Here's another resource. And again, these may not be appropriate for the situations you're looking at. I just wanted you to get an idea. If you look at the item on the left, that shows you that there are chapters on about being modest, being naked, dressing myself, things that you can use. And here's a real simple one. There are speaking bubbles and there are thinking bubbles. We can't tell you not to think these things because, quite frankly, you will, but you need to think about what comes out of your mouth. So it's a visual representation. It's concrete, and that's one way that we can start teaching. Another way is with visual scales, which goes to some of the interventions we've talked about today. These are 2 books by Carrie Dunbaron that represent visual scales. Just flipping here gives you a better idea of what this is. 5 is Against the Law can be a really nice pairing with talking about sexual behavior, because it goes anywhere from being informal all the way up to 5 being against the law. And it is when you touch someone, when you touch their personal, get into their personal space, touch their private areas, not only does that scare people, but it can get you in touch with the law. And it gives us an opportunity to start talking about where these behaviors might be, and gives us an opportunity to teach. Here's just another one. We hear a lot about masturbation being one of the areas that people really are concerned about. It's not that masturbation is wrong. It's not that people, I'm going to go out on a limb and say most of us have, and many people enjoy it. It's okay, but it's just, where does it happen and with whom? And so we have to teach that. And in some cases, you can add a special interest that really drives home the point that this is something I want to pay attention to. The Circles program you might be familiar with, and it fits into this sort of scale, and the scale being where certain people fit in this scale of my social interaction. And then redirection using visual supports. You need sometimes to let people know that there will be time. It's not a no, don't. It's just not now and where. And giving people, as it shows on the right, just a simple schedule. As we were talking about before, sometimes you need pictures rather than words, but you get the idea. And then strategies simply to relieve stress, because there is a lot of correlation, or there can be correlation between some of the sexual activity, masturbation, and such, and the stress and anxiety. And so thinking about ways that you can relieve that stress, given the weighted blankets again, stress balls, physical activity we've talked about in relationship to some aggressive behavior, I think it can come into play here as well, and giving those choices and options. I'm going to make a final note. I am not going to speak, it's not appropriate for me to speak about medication, but the literature does talk about the use of medications at times in relationship to this behavior. I would say, and we've got our medical folks in the room here, that please weigh very heavily before going into using medication that can have some long-term effects, especially if it's going to look at hormonal types of impact. That think about strategies ahead of time. Think about teaching. Think about environmental strategies before you go down that road, and then have a team with your medical staff to really think about it. If you go down that road, don't go away from these strategies. These strategies are still important to use at the same time. I'm okay on that, guys? Okay, just checking. And just really briefly, I think that it's important to understand that people with disabilities, these young adults, because they are moving into puberty, sexuality is a fundamental part of our life, and we need to respect that. It's just, how do we teach that? Everybody needs that information, and so often people that we're talking about, the youth that we're talking about, just do not get that. So in this PowerPoint are a number of resource articles, a number of websites, and so we can send this out to you.